Imagine a cold December night in 1910. A private train carried a handful of the most powerful bankers and politicians in the world to a remote island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. There were no reporters, no public eyes, just shadows of men who already controlled more wealth than nations. They gathered not for leisure, but for secrecy, to forge a plan that would change the course of American history forever. This meeting gave birth to the Federal Reserve, a central bank that was sold to the public as a guardian of financial stability. But in truth, it was designed by private bankers, for private bankers. The very act of its creation was cloaked in deception. Senators were told this bill was to protect the people from financial panic. But what it truly did was transfer the power of money creation from the government to private hands. Before the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the U.S. Treasury issued its own money, backed by gold and silver. Afterward, the game changed. Money became debt. Every dollar printed was no longer a direct promise from a nation. It was a promise to pay back a private central bank with interest. Think about that. A nation borrowing its own currency and generations paying for it. The public was never told the full story. Newspapers of the time whispered about banking reform, but the truth was buried under layers of political theater. The names of the men behind this plan, Warburg, Aldrich, Vanderlip, and others, became footnotes in history, yet their influence rippled across every paycheck, every loan, every war that would follow. From that moment on, the United States was no longer in full control of its own money. It had surrendered one of its greatest powers, the ability to create and manage its currency, to a private banking cartel operating behind a patriotic name, the Federal Reserve. And that was only the beginning, because once you control a nation's money, you don't just control its economy, you control its future. Now that the Federal Reserve had its grip on America, something extraordinary and terrifying began to happen. For the first time in U.S. history, money could be created not by the sweat of a worker, not by the production of real goods, but by the turning of a printing press or the click of a ledger. The Federal Reserve operates on a system called fractional reserve banking. Here's what that means in the simplest terms. If you deposit $100, your bank is only required to keep a fraction of that, say $10, and the rest can be loaned out. That loan becomes someone else's deposit, which can again be mostly lent out. This cycle multiplies money out of thin air. It's a cascade of debt that looks like wealth, but it isn't. This power to create money from nothing became the most potent weapon in modern history. Wars could now be funded without raising taxes. Governments could promise programs they couldn't afford. Debt became the new currency, and with it, control. Every borrowed dollar carried interest, and that interest flowed not into the hands of the people, but into the vaults of the banking elite who owned the system. And here's the dark truth. This is not just an American story. Once the Federal Reserve model proved successful, it was mirrored across the globe. Central banks, often privately influenced or connected, became the invisible rulers of nations. They didn't need to run for office. They didn't need to pass laws. They simply held the purse strings, and with that, the power to decide who thrives and who starves. Every financial crisis you ever read about, from the Great Depression to the 2008 meltdown, carried the fingerprints of this system. Boom and bust cycles became not just accidents of capitalism, but tools of consolidation. When markets crashed, wealth didn't disappear. It changed hands, from the many to the few. So when you hear about stimulus packages or quantitative easing, remember, they're not printing prosperity. They are printing chains. Chains made of paper promises and digital debt, binding generations to a system they never voted for and can barely understand. The Federal Reserve's power is not just in the dollars you hold. It is in the debt you owe, and the illusion that you are free because you can still spend. You wake up every day believing you are free. You go to work, you earn your paycheck, you spend your money, and yet, behind every swipe of your card, behind every free market headline, a hidden architecture of control moves quietly in the dark. The Federal Reserve no longer just creates money. It shapes behavior, dictates policy, and engineers crises that mold society itself. Look around. Why does debt keep rising no matter who's in power? Why do inflation and recessions appear like storms no one saw coming, yet always benefit the same few when the dust settles? Because the game is designed that way. Inflation is not an accident. It is a tool. It silently robs the savings of millions, transferring their value to those closest to the money printer, the central banks and their allies. Think about the last 2 decades. 2008's financial collapse wiped out retirement funds, homes, and businesses. But who got bailed out? The very institutions that caused it. Trillions were created, handed to banks, corporations, and hedge funds, while ordinary Americans were handed austerity, foreclosures, and layoffs. That is not freedom. That is financial feudalism dressed in modern clothes. Even today, the Federal Reserve manipulates interest rates like a puppeteer pulling strings, slowing economies when it wants control, fueling bubbles when it wants consolidation. The stock market soars, then crashes. Real estate climbs, then crumbles. Each cycle is a harvest. And guess who collects the crops? Not the worker, not the small business owner, but the same circle of elites who have held the keys since 1913. And here's the most dangerous illusion. They don't need to take your land by force. They don't need to send soldiers to your door. They tax you through inflation, they bind you through debt, and they distract you with the promise of growth tomorrow. What you call money, they call leverage. What you call savings, they call opportunity. And while you chase the dream of financial freedom, they quietly write the rules of the game. Now ask yourself, if the very system you trust is built to extract from you, can real freedom exist within it? Or have you been living inside a cage made not of bars, but of paper, digits, and promises that were never yours to begin with?
Wars are loud, cannons, soldiers, and banners waving, but the power behind them is always quiet. Behind every major conflict of the 20th century, from World War I to Iraq and beyond, there was a silent hand writing the checks, central banks with the Federal Reserve at the core. When the Federal Reserve was just 1 year old, World War I erupted. The US entered the war in 1917, and suddenly billions were needed to finance the conflict. Where did that money come from? It wasn't dug out of the ground. It wasn't earned by the sweat of American workers. It was created out of thin air, loaned to the government with interest. The debt didn't end with the war. It became a permanent burden carried by generations. This pattern repeated again and again. World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, each time the formula remained the same. Money was printed, debts ballooned, and ordinary people paid twice. First with their taxes, then with the inflation that followed. But here's the sinister part. War is the perfect cover for financial manipulation. It allows unlimited printing under the banner of patriotism. It forces nations into deeper debt traps. And when the smoke clears, who owns the bonds? Who owns the contracts? The same banking interests that stood behind the curtain in 1913. Even peacetime is not free from this machine. Economic sanctions, foreign aid, reconstruction projects, all of it tied to the same web of credit and control. The Federal Reserve doesn't just influence the US. Its policies ripple across oceans, breaking economies, toppling leaders, and reshaping nations. So, the next time you hear of a conflict brewing, ask yourself, who profits when the cannons fire? Who grows stronger when nations borrow? And who always seems to survive the chaos, richer, more entrenched, more untouchable? Because wars may end, but the debts they create do not. They live on, with interest.